On a routine test dive, a nuclear submarine simply stopped answering. It was the morning of April 10, 1963, in the deep Atlantic, more than 200 miles east of Cape Cod. The newest, most advanced attack submarine in the United States Navy was doing exactly what she had been built to do, diving deep, pushing toward the limits of what was possible. On the surface, a rescue ship listened on the underwater telephone. Then came a garbled, broken message. Fragments of words about minor difficulties, about trying to rise. And then, nothing. Silence. 129 men were gone in an instant, and the United States Navy would never be the same again. This is the story of the USS Thresher, the worst submarine disaster in American history, and the silence that changed the way every submarine since has been built. The Thresher was not some old, worn-out boat being pushed past her prime. She was the future. Ordered in 1958 and built at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in Kittery, Maine, she was launched in 1960 and commissioned in 1961. She was the lead vessel of an entirely new class of nuclear-powered fast attack submarines, and she represented the cutting edge of American naval engineering. She was faster, quieter, and could dive significantly deeper than anything that had come before her. Her hull was built to withstand crushing pressures. Her reactor gave her nearly unlimited endurance, and her sonar and weapons made her a formidable hunter. Her official motto was Vis Tacita, Latin for silent strength. By the spring of 1963, she had completed an extended overhaul and maintenance period and was returning to sea for a series of trials to certify that everything worked. One of those trials was the most demanding test a submarine can face. A dive all the way down to test depth, the maximum depth she was certified to reach, somewhere in the range of 1,300 feet. On that April morning, the Thresher was not alone. She was accompanied by a submarine rescue ship, the Skylark, which stayed on the surface directly above her. The two vessels were connected by the only link possible between a submerged submarine and the world above: the faint, crackling voice of the underwater telephone, a device that carries sound through the water itself. The submarine carried 129 souls that day, and it is worth pausing on exactly who they were. 16 were officers, 96 were enlisted sailors, and 17 were civilians, shipyard technicians and engineers, the experts who had worked on the boat and had come along to observe her performance on these critical trials. As the morning went on, the Thresher reported her depth to the Skylark and continued her slow, careful descent toward test depth. And then, just after 9 o'clock, the messages turned strange and then frightening. The Skylark received a broken transmission over the underwater telephone. The crew, it said, was experiencing difficulty. They reported a positive up angle, meaning the bow of the submarine was tilted upward as if she were straining to climb back toward the surface. And they were attempting to blow, the term for forcing high-pressure air into the ballast tanks to push the water out and make the submarine buoyant enough to rocket upward. These were not the words of a routine dive. These were the words of a crew that had recognized an emergency and was fighting, in those very seconds, for their lives. But the boat did not rise. To understand what almost certainly happened in those final minutes, you have to understand just how thin the line is between safe and catastrophic at that depth. The exhaustive investigation that followed, conducted by a Navy court of inquiry, pieced together the most probable chain of events. And it is a chain in which one small failure cascades into total disaster. It most likely began with the saltwater piping system. The Thresher's hull was threaded with miles of pipes carrying seawater for cooling and other systems, and those pipes were connected at hundreds of joints. The court concluded that one of those joints, probably in the engine room, gave way under the immense pressure of test depth. And here is the critical thing to understand. At that depth, a failed pipe does not simply leak or drip. The water outside is under such enormous pressure that it blasts into the compartment as a violent high-pressure jet, a spray powerful enough to cut and flood a space in seconds. That spray very probably struck electrical equipment and shorted it out. And on a nuclear submarine, a major electrical fault triggers an automatic safety shutdown of the reactor, called a scram. In an instant, the Thresher would have lost her propulsion, the very thing she needed most to drive herself back up toward the surface. With the reactor down and water flooding in, her last and only option was to blow her ballast tanks with high-pressure air. The crew tried. That is what the garbled message about attempting to blow tells us. But investigators believe that as the high-pressure air rushed through the system, moisture within the air lines froze, and ice choked the valves, strangling the airflow. Imagine trying to take a desperate breath through a straw that is freezing shut. The tanks could not empty fast enough. Without power, and without enough buoyancy, the most advanced submarine in the world began to sink backward into the dark. And here the physics becomes utterly merciless. Every single foot deeper means more crushing pressure bearing down on the hull. The Thresher sank past her test depth, then past the limits her designers had built her to survive. At a depth estimated at around 2,400 feet, the steel could no longer hold against the weight of the ocean. The hull collapsed. And the collapse, what engineers call an implosion, was so sudden and so violent that it happened in roughly 1/10 of a second, far faster than the human nervous system can even register pain or fear. It is one of the few mercies in this entire tragedy. The men aboard never knew the final instant had come. The Thresher came to rest broken into 6 major sections, scattered across the floor of the Atlantic in more than 8,000 feet of water. On the surface, the crew of the Skylark called and called into the underwater telephone and heard only silence answer back. As the hours passed, the terrible reality settled in. By that afternoon, the Chief of Naval Operations stood before the press and told the nation the unbearable truth. The submarine was lost, with all hands. The President of the United States ordered flags across the country flown at half-staff in honor of the men. It was, at that moment, the deadliest submarine disaster in the history of the world. But the story of the Thresher does not end in grief alone. And that is what makes it worth telling. Because the United States Navy made a decision in the wake of the tragedy. Those 129 men would not be lost for nothing. Out of the Court of Inquiry came a sweeping, rigorous new safety program launched at the end of 1963, called SubSafe. It was, and remains, one of the most demanding quality assurance programs ever created. It requires exhaustive design review, relentless testing, and above all, documented objective proof that every single critical component and material on a submarine meets its exact specification before that boat is ever allowed to dive deep. Nothing is assumed. Everything must be proven on paper and in practice. And the results speak across the decades with stunning clarity. In the years before the Thresher, the United States Navy had lost a string of submarines to accidents of various kinds. But in the more than 60 years since SubSafe began, only one submarine that was fully certified under the program has been lost at sea. One, The brutal lesson learned in the cold Atlantic in 1963 was turned into a discipline that has protected generations of submariners, men who climb aboard their boats and dive into the deep every day without ever knowing the names of the 129 whose deaths made their own service so much safer. Today, the Thresher rests where she fell, scattered across the abyssal plain, a war grave on the floor of the Atlantic, watched over and left in peace. She was not destroyed by an enemy torpedo or by reckless command. She was destroyed by the brutal, unforgiving margin of error that comes with sending human beings deeper than anyone had ever gone before, into a place the human body could never survive. The men aboard her were pioneers in the truest sense, explorers of a hostile frontier, and they paid the price that frontiers so often demand. Every submarine that dives safely today, every crew that comes home, carries a piece of their legacy down with them into the dark.